Thanks a lot, and good morning, colleagues. I'm an economist and a researcher, and over the years I've worked on many different issues, and it's certainly not the first, nor I hope the last time I touch on issues here in Wales. I suppose my core business over the years has been regional and local economic development. But over the last 2 or 3 years, myself and my close colleague Tina Beattie at Sheffield Hallam have really become the go-to people on the impact of welfare reform, or more specifically perhaps on quantifying the impact of welfare reform. And I'm going to look at that in the context today of Wales. There are 2 reports which you might wish to look at if you wanted to look further into our work. The first of those reports, which was published a couple of years ago, is really the parent report. It's the overview of what's happening across the whole of Great Britain. Some of the numbers and analysis in that are now becoming a little dated, I've got to say. Then there is a rather more recent report looking specifically at the impact of welfare reform on the valleys. And you can find both of those reports on the Sheffield Hallam University website. Okay, the reforms that we've been looking at and that all the numbers that I'm going to refer to this morning actually cover are this great list of reforms. Now, there's a lot going on here. Most of it has been introduced by the coalition government in Westminster since 2010, but not quite all of it. In particular, I think it's worth flagging up that some of the incapacity benefit reforms that have been working their way through the system over the last 2 or 3 years were actually initiated by Labour pre-2010, but have only recently been coming to fruition. I suspect 1 or 2 of you in this room know parts of the jigsaw, but not the whole. So I'll very, very quickly just whip through a number of slides on the details of what's going on. I won't attempt to talk through all the niceties of it all, but just so that you understand the total picture, if you like. There are big changes affecting housing benefit in the private rented sector. They concern what's known as the local housing allowance. Then there are reforms affecting housing benefit in the social rented sector, the infamous bedroom tax. What's often overlooked is there have also been changes in the regulations governing how much other non-dependents, grown-up children in work, for example, have got to contribute towards households' rent, and therefore that results in reduced housing benefit entitlement. There is a new overall household benefit cap. That's been one of the flagship initiatives of the coalition government, set at £26,000 a year. Changes to council tax benefits. Now, Wales is in a rather different position here. Central government, the government in Westminster, has reduced the financial payment to the devolved administrations and local authorities in England by 10%, and that reduction is supposed to be not passed on to pensioner households. In Wales and in Scotland, you have found, or rather the Welsh Government has found, methods of averting passing that reduction on to claimants, so that one doesn't apply here. Disability living allowance, we've got a changeover from DLA to something called personal independence payments. Incapacity benefits, there's an awful lot been happening. The first 4 bullet points there were all Labour measures that have only just been feeding through in the last few years. The coalition government's own contribution is the 5th of those sub-bullet points. Time limiting of non-means tested benefit for ESA claimants in the work-related activity group, which is a bit of a mouthful, but let me try to translate that. What that means is if you go through all the new medical tests, the work capability assessment, and you continue to qualify for incapacity benefits, these days employment and support allowance, and if you are placed in what's called the work-related activity group, which all but the most severely ill or disabled are placed in, then you will find that for the first time your benefit entitlement is means tested after 12 months. So if you have a partner in work, if you have significant savings, or if you have a big pension income, for example, because you've had to retire early on the grounds of ill health, then you will find that you lose your entitlement to means-tested ESA. Changes to child benefit, a lot of detailed changes to tax credit entitlements, and then to capital we've had the 1% uprating of benefits rather than uprating by inflation. Now, what's not on the list there, and particularly I'll highlight the first one there, is universal credit, because universal credit is really in a different category to the other welfare reforms, whereas the other welfare reforms are all about saving the exchequer money. Essentially, you should understand universal credit as a repackaging of existing benefits. It introduces a consistent withdrawal rate throughout the system. But in the short run, at least, it's not intended actually to take any money out of claimants' pockets. And most of the impact of the changeover to universal credit, if they can ever get it to work, is still some way into the future. Now, how have we gone about measuring the impacts of these welfare reforms? When I speak to some audiences, I'm very nervous about this slide and the next one because it's getting into the technical details, but I would hope at a conference organised by a data unit that you don't mind me dwelling a moment on this aspect of the work. All of the statistics that I'm going to present are ultimately rooted in the Treasury's own estimates of how much they expect to save as a result of each of the welfare reforms. That is the starting point. The government's own impact assessments get us so far along the road in terms of understanding how that impact is going to work out in terms of different households and different places, but they don't get us very far. The crucial building block that you've got to bring to bear is local benefit data. By local authority and in some cases by ward in order to trace through how those national policy changes are likely to impact on specific places. And when we're looking at the impacts on different types of households, again, we bring to bear official statistics, and in particular the Family Resources Survey, which was mentioned a little earlier, which gives us figures on what sorts of households draw on what sorts of benefits. The other statistical points that I need you to bear in mind, this is the boring bit I'm afraid, are that some of the welfare reforms target households as a whole, such as the housing benefit changes, but others target individuals, the DLA changes, the incapacity benefit changes. And some individuals and some households are hit by more than one element of the reforms. They can be hit by 4, 5, 6 elements simultaneously. However, the impact is overwhelmingly on working age benefit claimants. Very little impact outside of that group, and I'm going to demonstrate that later. The statistics I'm going to show you as well present the figures when all of these reforms have come to full fruition. Now, you might think that the welfare reforms have already happened and that they've been fully implemented. Well, some have and some haven't. The DLA to PIP changeover has barely started. Probably little more than 10% of the financial loss there has arisen so far. The incapacity benefit reforms, too, have been badly stalled just recently because of the backlog of appeals, because Atos, the prime contractor on the work capability assessments, has walked away from its contracts. And that, in turn, has delayed the implementation, the coming into effect of the time limiting of the ESA entitlement. The final thing I need you to bear in mind is that when I'm documenting the impact of the welfare reforms, we're holding everything else constant. And in particular, we're making no assumptions about higher levels of employment in relation to loss of benefit income. But I will come back to that point towards the end. Right, so let's get into the numbers. These are our best and updated estimates of the financial losses in Wales arising from each element of the welfare reforms. You won't find any of those figures in the couple of reports that I referenced earlier, because those figures are bang up to date and have been revised during this last month. They've been revised on the basis of the Treasury's new estimates of the savings that will arise nationally across the UK as a whole as a result of each particular element. You can see that there are some big losses. Tax credits, often the changes there seem to go through under the radar. Big financial losses, £230 million a year being taken out of Wales because of the tax credit changes. 200 million will be taken out when the DLA reforms have come to full fruition, and 90% of that is probably still into the future. The incapacity benefit reforms, which are by no means yet fully operational, another 180 million there, and so on and so on. You will see that the household benefit cap, which has resulted in so much publicity, actually in Wales accounts for very, very modest financial savings. The number of households affected are really quite small here. In the second column, there are figures on the average financial loss for those affected by each element of the reforms. So the 1% operating, for example, takes a little bit off a lot of people, but the disability living allowance reforms and the IB reforms result in substantial losses to the individuals and households affected. The Welsh Government has produced its own estimates, I've got to say, of the impacts of welfare reform. I'm sure one or two of you have seen those figures. They are not actually fundamentally different from the figures that we've been coming up with. There are some differences at the edges because of what we've put in and what they've put in, and you know, we've left out certain things and they've left out certain things, but we're in the same ballpark. But we were there first. We were 9 months ahead of the Welsh Government. How does Wales compare with the rest of the country? Well, adding all of those reforms together, we're estimating that Wales loses a little over £1,000 million a year. Let me just repeat that. £1,000 million a year as a result of the welfare reforms, which is hardly surprising when you consider that these reforms are going to take 18 billion out of claimants' pockets when they're fully operational, 18 billion a year. But the impact in Wales is distinctly larger than in several parts of Great Britain. It averages £520 per adult of working age. Now, that's not £520 per claimant. That's an average across the entire working age population. That's the average across everybody aged between the 16 and 64 in Wales. It's like £500 from virtually every one of you in this room. That's a measure of the impact. Parts of northern England are hit a little harder. London is hit quite hard, but look down at the bottom of the list. It's prosperous southern England that escapes quite lightly. And just to underline that point, this is a map of the impact by local authority. You don't need to read the scale on there. The dark areas across the country are those where the welfare reforms impact hardest. And if you know your geography of Britain tolerably well, you should be able to spot three groups of areas that have been hammered. One are the older industrial areas. Down here, for example, in South Wales and in particular in the valleys. Up in northern England, large chunks of industrial northern England, northeast England, central Scotland. Second group of places that are rather badly affected are a number of London boroughs, and that's primarily because of some of the changes to housing benefit. And the third group of places, if you look around the coastline, you'll see a number of seaside towns that don't come out of this very well. By contrast, that big white area escapes relatively lightly. And if you've ever seen a map like that before, think back to election nights and the sorts of patterns that emerge. But on election nights, the blue areas aren't coloured in blue. The impact by local authority in Wales. I mean, it's almost an iron law of welfare reform that if you're taking money out of benefit claimants' pockets, then it's going to hit hardest in the places where there are the largest numbers of benefit claimants, either out-of-work benefit claimants or in-work claimants. And that's true in Wales just as it's true across Britain as a whole. Look, those are the Valleys authorities at the head of the list, headed there by Merthyr and Neath Port Talbot and Bly now, at the other end of the spectrum, at Monmouthshire. But let's not say everything's rosy in Monmouthshire. Monmouthshire is still getting hit a lot harder than many parts of Surrey or Berkshire. There is a clear relationship between the impacts of welfare reform and deprivation. Each one of those dots on that graph is a local authority district across Britain. The vertical scale is the impact of the reforms measured in terms of the average loss per adult of working age. The horizontal scale measures deprivation. The higher the level of deprivation in the local authority, the bigger the financial hit. I'll just whip through one or two maps on the individual reforms themselves, and I want to go through this very, very quickly. This one is the impact of the housing benefit reforms in the private rented sector. Big impact in London. That's London sitting somewhere in the North Sea on this particular map and on the others. Whereas the bedroom tax impacts much more in particularly parts of the north where the social rented sector accounts for a higher proportion of the overall housing stock and where there's high levels of worklessness. Non-dependent deductions, that's a bit of an amalgam of the last two. Household benefit cap, it's almost exclusively a London issue because it really only comes into effect in areas where there are very, very high rent levels which have previously been giving very, very high entitlement to housing benefit. Barely an issue in Wales. Council tax benefit, Wales is white there because the reduction in council tax grant is not being passed on to claimants, nor is it in Scotland, nor is it in one or two parts of England where the councils have absorbed the hit within their own budgets. Disability living allowance and this one, incapacity benefit reforms, look very similar because the two benefits often go hand in hand, and in particular in the older industrial areas of Britain we have parked vast numbers of non-employed adults of working age out of the labour market on incapacity benefits, and we've done so for the best part of 30 years. It's the way we've hidden the true scale of unemployment. And many of the people on incapacity benefits, in fact it's about half of those on incapacity benefits, actually also claim disability living allowance as a top-up. Not much impact in the prosperous southeast of England. Child benefit, that's very different from all of the rest, and when that one dropped out we thought, what on earth is going on here? Well, they're withdrawing child benefit from households with a higher earner, aren't they? You know, if you have one earner that has an income of £60,000 or more, you lose all your entitlement. And it's tapered the loss between £50,000 and £60,000. Where are the higher earners? Well, they're not in Wales, are they? Not on average, anyway. Tax credits, primarily an impact anywhere where there is low-wage employment. and the 1% operating hits the places where there are large numbers drawing on working age benefits. Okay, that's the geography at the district level, but there are two other things about the impact I want to highlight, and that should be of relevance to you. One is, even beyond the level of local authorities, there is a big difference in the impact at the local level, at the level of wards. Some electoral wards are hit much harder than others. The other point is that some households and some types of households are hit much harder than others. To illustrate the impact by ward, this is lifted from our report on the impact of welfare reform on the valleys. Ignore the white areas on that map, by the way, because there are no statistics that we've generated for those white areas. So just look at the areas that have various shades of blue, and this maps the intensity of the impact up and down the valleys. The very lightest shades of blue on there are the places where the average financial loss arising from the welfare reforms is below the GB average. And there's not very much there. Even if you go to the next darkest category, those are places above the GB average, but below the Welsh average. And the two darker categories are both above the Welsh average in terms of the financial losses, with the very darkest category being wards where the average financial loss is more than 50% above the Welsh average, and that really is sky high. Bear in mind the Welsh average is £520 per adult per year. Who, in terms of individuals and households, is most affected by the losses? Now, I'm not going to go through these slides mechanically, but just scan your eye across them. Look for buzzwords like low income, older, especially older working age, sick or disabled. And often, as I said earlier, these reforms are impacting simultaneously, several of the reforms are impacting simultaneously on the same individuals and households. And it's really rather shocking when you put together the statistics in terms of which households, what types of households are hit hardest. These are newish numbers. I don't think you'll find them in those two reports that I flagged up earlier. They're our estimate for Britain as a whole of the average financial loss for different sorts of households. And all of the households in Britain, or indeed in Wales, can be fitted into one or another of those 15 categories. Some interesting points here. Pensioner households are escaping virtually unscathed. And that's because the Westminster government has designed the reforms in that way. To be adversely affected by the reforms as a pensioner, you have to be either in the private rented sector and drawing on housing benefit, and relatively few people above state pension age are in that position. Or you've got to be in the rather unusual position of being above state pension age, but still having a child for whom you're able to claim child benefit. So very few pensioners are affected. On the other hand, those numbers for households with dependent children are alarmingly large, and I think that has again been something that's gone under the radar, because it's not the impact of any single reform, it's actually the cumulative impact of a lot of reforms working together. We're on about the average loss for lone parents being something at around the £2,000 a year mark for lone parents with dependent children. Oh, incidentally, students escape unscathed as well. You'll see student households, and there are plenty of those in Cardiff. Bundling all of this together, approaching 2/3 of the overall financial loss arising from welfare reform is falling on households with dependent children. Around 40% is falling on the sick and disabled through the DLA and IB reforms, and they lose through other reforms too. And almost half is falling on in-work households. Don't add up those proportions, there's some overlap between those groups, by the way, but it gives you some feel for who's in the firing line. Now, Westminster ministers, of course, say that it'll be all right on the night. That one of the effects of the welfare reforms, one of the major effects of the welfare reforms will be that more people will look for work and more people will therefore find work, and the loss of benefit income will be offset by increased income from employment. Really? Number of points to bear in mind. It was always the case, long before these reforms, that out-of-work benefit claimants were, in the vast majority of circumstances, already financially better off if they went into work. The reforms increased the incentive, yes, but bear in mind, many of the places where the impacts of the reforms are largest, like the Welsh Valleys, are some of the weakest economies in Britain. And out-of-work claimants also tend to be some of the least attractive to employers. They often have low levels of skill, they have poor health, and they've been out of work for long periods of time. Frankly, I don't believe that in the weaker local economies, such as substantial parts of Wales, including the valleys in particular, that the reforms will lead to higher levels of employment. Is there an alternative? This is a back-of-the-envelope calculation we've done. Don't hold me to the numbers, but I think we've got it in the right ballpark. Looking at what would be the financial saving if you could generate 100,000 new jobs here in Wales. You'd obviously reduce the amount of spending on out-of-work benefits. You'd generate extra tax revenue. We estimate that 100,000 new jobs in Wales would save the Exchequer in London around about £1,000 million a year, which is extraordinarily close to our estimate of the savings to the Exchequer of the welfare reforms. So 100,000 new jobs would do the trick. Is it realistic? It would require the Welsh economy to grow by 3 to 3.5% a year over 5 years. That's quite a goal, but it's by no means unachievable, so long as we get the right policies in place here in Wales and in Westminster. So to conclude, the impact of the welfare reforms is substantial. Many deprived parts of Britain, including parts of Wales, are hit hardest. And a key effect of the reforms will be to widen the gaps in prosperity between the best and the worst local economies, and indeed to increase the inequalities between households. Is there an alternative? Of course there is. It's called economic growth. Thank you.